how important is the collaboration between the sites, sponsors, regulators, and the technology providers in driving the meaningful transformation?
It really is the most important part of that, because if we don't have...
What advice would you give to healthcare organizations or emerging research sites looking to build a sustainable clinical research programs?
To me, it's a lot about the basics, making sure that you start with foundationally what you need to know.
Welcome to Life Science Insights Podcast. I am your host, Sandal Karnanidhi. Today, I'm excited to welcome Jimmy Bechtel, Chief Site Success Officer at Society for Clinical Research Sites. Jimmy is a passionate advocate for clinical research sites and healthcare professionals, helping build a more sustainable and a future-ready research ecosystem. We will discuss the evolving clinical trial landscape, the site success strategies, and the innovation shaping the future of research. Thanks for joining us, Jimmy.
Happy to be here. Thanks.
Okay. Can you share your professional journey? What led you to the clinical research and the site management industry?
Sure. So I started my career fresh out of college, actually at a research site. So I was doing an internship in the finance department, and the executive over the finance department happened to also be the executive that oversaw the research department. And a job happened to come up at the time that I was concluding my internship, and the rest is kind of history. I worked at the research site for several years, making my way up through various capacities. Lab work, coordinator, patient recruiter, data entry, regulatory manager, and was being groomed for management when I made my way over to the industry side. I worked at Eli Lilly and Company for another number of years, and then in their clinical innovations team. And from there was brought into SCRS, where I am today. And I've made my way through project management and ownership into the executive role that I sit at now.
Got it. It's an interesting journey.
Absolutely. It's been fun.
Yeah. So as a Chief Site Success Officer at the Society for Clinical Research Sites, what does site success truly mean in today's evolving clinical trial landscape?
That's a big question. We could probably just spend the entirety of the discussion talking about that very subject. But site success means for SCRS, sites having a voice in the conversation. So when decisions are being made and we're asking our sites to do things and execute their clinical trials in a certain way or interact with their patients in a certain way, that they have feedback into that process, and that they're involved in the decisions that go around making that, and then ultimately leading to their sustainability and their success as an organization, wanting to make sure that their future exists and that they continue to run a business that allows them to do exactly what they're needed for, and that is serving as that very important connection to the patients so that they can ultimately serve them as best as possible.
Okay, got it. The clinical research sites are under increasingly operational pressure. What are the biggest challenges sites are facing right now?
Again, another numerous answer question that we could talk about for several hours. We run every year what we call the site landscape survey, and that gives us quantitative and qualitative insights into what the current challenges are at the site level. And what we're seeing in the preliminary data for this year, we actually just presented our first set of data at the SCRS West conference, is that protocol complexity continues to be a really major challenge at the site level. And it's important for people to understand when we talk about protocol complexity, the difference between inherent protocol complexity, which is really classified as the nature of the diseases and the molecules, the medicines that we're creating are just more complicated. And there's little that we can do about that. There is this, again, inherent complexity that exists in treating a complex disease or treating a disease or condition in a complex way. What we can do something about, and what we do want to address, and what we have a lot of conversation around at SCRS, is the non-inherent operational complexity that we bring into clinical trials. So asking sites to do things just in general that don't really have significant bearing on the outcome of that trial. They're operationally more complex than they need to be as a result. So really looking at those things and asking ourselves what sorts of activities and execution models or occurrences at the visit are actually fit for purpose or really based in a quality by design type of methodology. Are there different approaches that we can take? Can we be flexible with those approaches? Are the types of questions that we should be asking ourselves? And again, harkening back to my previous answer, where we should be involving sites and patients in those decisions.
Okay, yeah, good to know. Why is site sustainability became such a critical topic across the clinical research ecosystem?
Yeah, a great question. It's site sustainability is really core to the success of the clinical trial enterprise. We can't do anything without the research site. They are the window to the patient. And one of the sayings that we often use within SCRS is that site success impacts everyone in research. Because if the sites are successful and they're sustainable and they're able to continue to conduct clinical trials in a way that allows them from a business perspective to maintain that practice, then we will continue to see the medicines and advance and the patients being treated, because again, they serve as that really critical link between what the sponsors and CROs are trying to accomplish, but also then bringing again important medicines and treatments to the patients. So they sit again at that cruxical intersection between those two ends of the triangle as really an essential piece. So if they're not sustainable, then we very quickly start to lose that important component.
Yeah, it's very important to measure, right?
Absolutely.
How can sponsors and CROs better support research sites to improve long-term collaboration efficiency?
Yeah, excellent question as well. There's a lot of different things we can do. And again, we start to gain insights into that exact question through SCRS and through things like our Eagle survey and the site landscape survey, where we basically ask that exact same question. There's a lot of different ways that we can go about doing that. Some of them include addressing some of the challenges directly. When we talk about collaboration and efficiency, it's about the appropriate channels and individuals that are related to the site portion of the relationship. And what I mean by that is we use the term having a single point of contact. While that is general and not always the case, not always doable, the sentiment remains the same, that having somebody that the site can liaise with that is knowledgeable, first and foremost, and actually able to help the site with their questions and get things done and not having to go back to 5 different layers of questions or approvals or bureaucracy to be able to make things happen is a really important aspect of especially both long-term collaboration and efficiency. And finding ways to build those relationships and having a better understanding of that dynamic is really important. Another example that I would use is the feasibility process. If we're talking about long-term relationships with sites and working on clinical trial efficiency, then understanding that the feasibility process, it should be an iterative one and not a brand new initiation every single time that a site that you've worked with maybe 6, 7, 8, 20, 30 times before, having to go through that same feasibility process. Again, it's a waste of time. It's a waste of everyone's effort. So that's a more succinct example of that. But I mean, the examples are numerous in which we can do. Is also an area that we can look to provide better, more sustainable relationships with our sites, because we oftentimes ask them to do redundant training or training that's unnecessary for their role. So that's a very succinct area which we might be able to form better and more effective relationships long term.
Okay, good. What role does technology play in reducing administrative burden and improving site operations?
That's a really exciting opportunity for us to implement technology into the clinical trial process. We've been along this journey when we talk about decentralized clinical trials, and which has been a thing for a long time, but really came to a head as a result of the COVID pandemic and our reduction in the ability to travel and have person-to-person contact. We've been able to see some efficiencies gained through that, but also some challenges that arose as well. But we know that artificial intelligence is going to serve an ever increasing role and have a stronger presence in the execution of the clinical trial process from start to finish. We're seeing areas like recruitment, more effective and efficient recruitment. We're looking at areas of site assessment and site understanding and knowledge, but also then the efficiencies at the site level from an operational perspective and an administrative perspective. That's where sites are really looking at this, is where from an administrative perspective can I implement some of these tools to make my team more efficient and effective and reduce some of the more menial or repetitive tasks that may or may not even be related to patient care, simply from running a business perspective. But so there's a lot of opportunity for us in technology through continued efficiencies and time gain with decentralized trial elements, but also the future is exciting with artificial intelligence. We're just starting to dabble and really starting to understand what those opportunities are and how they'll play themselves out, especially when we talk about protocol efficiency. SCRS is really looking at tools related to how the sites manage and use their protocols that could relate from an artificial intelligence perspective as well.
Okay, good to know you're using a lot of AI technology.
We are, yes, and we're excited to help usher the sites into that future through some of the programs that we're getting ready to introduce.
Got it. Okay. Decentralized and hybrid clinical trials continue to evolve. How are research sites adapting to these new models?
Yeah, great. It's a great continuation. I would say that it's good and bad. We've seen a lot of efficiencies and a lot of opportunities here with decentralization of the clinical trial process and various elements, we like to call them, of the study being decentralized. What I think is really important for us to understand is, and it sounds like a lot of sponsors and CROs are embarking down this path and they're adopting this type of model, and that is to be flexible and provide optionality. It doesn't have to be my way or the highway for the sites, right? Here, you need to use this technology on the study or you can't do the study. We're seeing less and less of that, which is really, really awesome. We're seeing these tools and technologies provided as a potential avenue for the sites. Now, the consequences of that we can talk about at another time and what that actually looks like down the road. But sites are actively adopting these new models. They're seeking them out. Some of them are even adopting them for their own and not even waiting for the sponsors and CROs to implement the technology for that clinical trial, because they're starting to see the operational efficiencies that can exist when they adopt that across their entire enterprise for instances that last beyond a single trial or for a single organization.
Okay. But what are the biggest pain points the investigators and the site staff experience during the trial execution?
Yeah, I mentioned some of them previously. It kind of harkened back to some of those. I think training really is one of the top three issues, rather, that the sites are experiencing when it comes to clinical trial execution, and getting up to speed with that process becomes burdensome and extremely time consuming in a way in which there is efficiencies and reductions that can happen to help do some of that. SCRS has done work in that space as well. We have an initiative called Cut 25 where we talk about and identify what the challenges exist in training and how we might look at various areas, right? What is the low-hanging fruit when it comes to reducing training? If we're talking specifically about execution, recruitment, it continues to be the most targeted area for potential improvement and potential challenge here as a pain point for the sites. And we've done a lot of different things as an industry, right? Recruitment campaigns, centralized recruitment, even using AI in the recruitment space. But there's a lot of opportunity there and for there to be improvements and efficiencies.
Okay. I have a question, right? How do you see the trial execution across geography?
Yeah, it's such an interesting question and perspective because in recent times, given the geopolitical state of the world, what it means to that question looks very different now than it did several years ago, is what I'm trying to say. we see a lot of companies that are looking beyond the United States or beyond some of their traditional markets from an R&D perspective to execute some of their clinical trials. And we have we've been trying to keep up with that adjustment. We've been really investing our time into regions like Asia and Taiwan and South Africa and Latin America, Brazil and Argentina, and Mexico, and all the other wonderful opportunities that exist in some of these regions where we see, again, a lot of our sponsor and CRO partners are looking to deepen relationships with sites because they're making larger investments into those regions as well. So it is interesting to learn about and interesting to try to stay current on, because it has changed so much in the last 4 or so years.
Yes. How important is patient engagement and retention in improving the trial outcomes and the site performance?
I would easily encourage everyone and myself make the argument that patient engagement and retention focus is the most, if not one of the most important aspects of trial outcomes and site performance. Because if the sites don't have patients, right, that directly affects their performance. I think we can all draw the obvious ties to some of those things, but if we can, it's one thing, as I just mentioned, to recruit patients and the challenges that exist there, but it's another thing entirely when you look at continuing to engage those patients and retain them in the clinical trial and treating them respectfully. So we have to look at that entire patient experience from start to finish as to how we can maintain patients and even post-trial, because oftentimes we see that our patients who have participated in a clinical research study, having had a positive experience, are much more likely to participate in another one down the road. And that obviously is more applicable of a statement in certain disease states and with certain clinical trials and conditions than it is for others. Some patients have even come to rely on the clinical trial process for their longevity and their lives themselves. So they've exhausted all their treatment options, et cetera. I argue that it should sit at the top of our focus as a site. What we can rally around, in other words, as sites in partnership with sponsors and CROs.
That is a critical component for this, right?
Yeah, that's right.
The workforce shortage remain a concern across healthcare and research. How can the industry attract and retain the best generations of clinical research professionals?
That's a tough question to answer, because no one's really done a great job at this. We've talked about it a lot, and we talked about it even more so. It kind of became this mission critical issue and challenge that we saw again post-COVID pandemic, when we saw this mass exodus of clinical research staff from the research sites and a lot of movement from one organization type to the other. A lot of them went to work for the sponsors and CROs. So we started to see a lot of turmoil exist and rear its head, if you will, in the workforce space. Then there's a lot of potential paths we can go on here. I know there are certain organizations that have invested a lot of time and energy into this, SCRS being one of those, but a lot of it is just understanding and education and spreading the word around clinical research as a career option, first and foremost. I think that really does serve as the foundation, and a lot of these other solutions that have been developed and a lot of these other programs are, again, really born from that as a concept. Because a lot of individuals, most of us in this industry, you talk to anybody and they'll tell you, I never went and sought clinical research as a career option. It fell into my lap. I'm a perfectly good example of someone who was going into healthcare finance as an intern and stumbled into clinical research. So we see that there's not enough awareness or not enough knowledge, and that's probably a great place for us to start and look at in general terms for how we grow and what we need to look at for the workforce.
Okay, good. What lessons has the industry learned from the recent years about resilience and the operational agility in clinical research?
Wow. Speaking of recent, it seems like we move from one challenge to the next as an industry. And a lot of these global challenges affect us oftentimes directly. We face things like the COVID pandemic and the challenging effects that had, but also the opportunities that had for our industry. It brought clinical research into a limelight with the development of the vaccines and the treatments for COVID. So that was a really, really interesting opportunity, and a lot of that was founded in the resilience. Right, we became the front lines as research sites for the care that was occurring for these patients who either were needing to be vaccinated or cared for during their illness, or preventing the illness of COVID. But a lot of these challenges with decentralization and the rapid implementation of some of that onto our clinical trials was detrimental. But everyone really rallies around the patient, and they're here for the patient, and they know that if we're doing this, we're doing it for our patients. So a lot of people, despite the challenges that we saw over these last maybe 5 to 8 years, have been grounded in, well, it's what's best for the patients. And if we can continue to make sure that we move everything in that direction, and that we ground ourselves in what's really best for the patient itself, and how that, plugging the work that we do, how that ultimately needs to take shape at the research site level, then I think we will continue to be, as you said, resilience and agile in the work that we do.
Okay. We just talked about AI, but how do you see AI in automation influencing site operations and the clinical trial management in the future?
Yeah, I mean, we touched on it. I'll reiterate some of the things that I touched on previously, but I think there's a lot of opportunity. It's so fun to be in part of these conversations and talk about, well, can we use AI here, or how can AI be applied here? There's a lot of excitement around it, and a lot of again, opportunity and possibility for us to really find some efficiencies with the use of AI in our clinical trials, both at the site and at the sponsor and CRO level. But there's, of course, a lot of cautions that we need to take, and a lot of things that we need to take into consideration, because we are ultimately dealing with experimental treatments, and we're dealing with patient information. And when you have those things, you have as everyone listening probably understands, there's a certain set of safeguards that we need to do. So taking the time, I think, is really the message that we're hearing now. Taking the time to kind of step back, not jump in just kind of head first into the dark water that is AI, and stepping back and understanding what's underneath that water and how we avoid the rocks is a really important step for us to take as an industry. Awareness for what's happening and what the possibilities are, and working towards those, I think, is really, really important. Like, let's not be scared to jump, but at the same time, certain areas require us to take certain precautions.
Okay. Data overload and the system fragmentations are the common issues for sites. How can the industry improve interoperability and the workflow integration?
Yeah, we talk a lot about, it's a great question. We talk a lot about system fragmentation and this desire for interoperability. It's been when we have talked about technology and some of the challenges we've faced over the last few years with the implementation of more and more technology onto clinical trials, that interoperability and integration, those two I words, have always been really the top areas, again, evidenced through the site landscape as the desires for the sites, right? When we talk about what are the challenges with technology, how do we solve them? It's those two things. So I think those, you're exactly right in that they remain and continue to remain common issues, but we've seen a lot of organizations really take that to heart, take that into consideration. And we're starting to see more and more systems that allow data and information to flow more effectively and more efficiently without duplicate data entry, or missteps with data, entering it in one place, having to enter it again, and it being wrong in one of those places. So we're seeing EHR data flowing into the EDC, and eSource flowing into the EDC and into the EHR. And I think there's, again, talking about this example of AI, there's probably something there as well that we'll start to see develop that will enable that work to happen more effectively and efficiently at the site level, because that does become very redundant when those systems don't talk to each other. So maybe there's additional solutions that we can layer in that help solve some of that interoperability and integration challenges.
Got it. But how critical is the data?
I mean, it's mission critical, right? That is ultimately, you can think of it pragmatically, and you can think of it in a bunch of different ways, and it doesn't matter. You all lead to the same. You lead to the same path. That without that data, it really doesn't matter any of the effort that was done. So if we can't maintain the accuracy and the integrity of that data, amongst probably several other adjectives that one would use to describe that data, then the trial was for naught, right? And the effort, and what matters most is the effort that the sites and the patients then put in to that becomes invalidated and unappreciated as well. So as we have to be able to understand how critical that data is constantly. I don't think I probably have to say that to too many people. Most of us understand that, but how that takes shape and your perspective changes really just kind of depending on where you sit in conjunction with the hands into that data.
Okay, good. What trends are you seeing around diversity, accessibility, and inclusion in clinical trial participation?
Yeah, we continue to understand and perpetuate the importance of the simple science behind why those accessibility and inclusion and accessible patient populations continue to be such an important part of clinical trials, right? It's just good science to be able to make sure that we are creating medicines that have been trialed on patients that are representative of those that actually have that disease in real life. And if we don't do that, we can probably cite, I can't off the top of my head, but there's probably people out there that are much smarter than me that can cite examples of when that hasn't been done, and the effect that has ultimately on that medicine, and the effect that it has on certain patient populations as a result of not taking the time to make sure that they were included in the clinical trial process. So there is, again, that pragmatic approach to those, in making sure that we are, again, including patients that represent the patients in real life that are affected by the disease state, but also then it just, the simple fact that it's good humanity to be able to make sure that we're doing exactly what we need to do and including the appropriate patients in those trials.
Okay. But how important is a collaboration between the sites, sponsors, regulators, and the technology providers in driving the meaningful transformation?
It really is the most important part of that, because if we don't have that collaboration, then we won't have meaningful transformation.
Correct.
We will see sponsors and CROs steaming ahead without involving the sites and the patients. We will see the technology providers that are simply focused on the sale and what that means for the sponsor and CROs, but then leaving the users out of that conversation, the sites and the patients, is never a good thing. That eventually will lead us to a piece of technology or a solution that isn't actually operational or usable at the clinical trial, right? We can cite examples like that all day, but making sure and facilitating, and that's a lot of what the work that SCRS does is building and providing these opportunities for us to get at exactly what we're talking about here, is channels for effective, meaningful transformation and how we facilitate that interaction, which didn't exist prior to SCRS being into an existence. So we feel, because it's core to our mission and our values, that really is one of the most important foundational steps to continuing to advance clinical trials.
Okay, good to know. What advice would you give to healthcare organizations or emerging research sites looking to build a sustainable clinical research programs?
To me, it's a lot about the basics, making sure that you start with foundationally what you need to know to not only execute a clinical trial, which is very different and continues to become very different from standard clinical care, but also what it means to run a clinical research site from a business perspective as well, because again, that looks very different. There's so much nuance that exists in the clinical research business model and the running a research site that just simply doesn't exist in any other space. So understanding foundationally what those differences are and getting the basics down really, really well, even the things as simple as negotiating a budget and a contract, and building an effective research team that has all of the skills and knowledge required to successfully ultimately treat patients and execute research protocols are examples of some of those basics that a site should have in place if they're looking to build a sustainable program.
Okay. So looking ahead 5 to 10 years, how do you envision the future of clinical research site, the model evolving?
Yeah. Interesting perspective because we've talked a lot about artificial intelligence, and that's kind of the crux of my answer right now. And I think we'll start to see machine learning and skill adaptability and necessity change as a result of the continued proliferation of AI based tools into our industry, ideally allowing us to become more sustainable as a research site, because we've moved past some of those challenges as a result of implementing some of these tools, so we can really get down to what we're trying to do here, and that is get medicines to patients faster. So whatever we need to do to get those things out of the way, I think we have an opportunity to do that with technology, as long as we maintain that focus, right? It's not necessarily driving us towards higher profits, but it really is towards how do I get this clinical trial executed as quickly and safely as possible and free up the site's time to do what they need to do, and that is to treat patients and gather the data that we need.
Okay. And finally, what excites you most about the future of clinical research and the impact it can have on patient care worldwide?
We're at the cutting edge of what it means to treat disease and treat patients and bring them the medicines that they need. So every single day, we are lucky enough to be in an industry that sees breakthroughs to treat and manage conditions that previously haven't had a treatment or a condition management. We just had the opportunity to hear from a patient at our SCRS West conference, where she shared that for the first time, the FDA is fast tracking for all intents and purposes, layman's terms here, a vaccine for a condition known as Lynch syndrome, which is a genetic predisposition to a significantly higher rate of cancer. And the number of individuals in her family alone that have passed away from various different cancers as a result of this Lynch syndrome was staggering to hear. And then to hear her kind of culminate her what she shared with us about this treatment, it really does remind you and ground you in that this is what we're here to do. And those treatments, what's exciting to me is that ideally we're able to accelerate the development of those treatments over time, and we're moving to a place where we can move quicker because we have better tools and knowledge and understanding at our fingertips of these diseases and how to treat them, and the genetic components that exist for a lot of them that we're really looking at today. So that's really what's exciting me about patient care.
Okay, good. And thank you for joining us today. Hope you enjoyed the conversation. It was truly interesting and insightful discussion. Thank you again for your time and sharing your valuable expertise with us.
It was my pleasure. Thanks for having me.